of recent events. And I'm sure that Dr. Insel will be the subject of many questions, and I think would welcome dialogue, both in relationship to what he's going to be talking about, as well as other, perhaps broader questions. We also are delighted that our president, George Driesen, who is well known to those in this congregation, will be providing a Jewish perspective on mental illness in terms of our historical traditions. I'm going to give some brief introductory remarks about Dr. Insel, and then George will come up and will further introduce our speaker and talk about some of the things that relate specifically to the Jewish theme. Tom Insel is the director of the National Institute of Mental Health, which he's served as director since 2002, and really directs our nation's investment for research on the causes and treatments of mental disorders. I have to say, at a personal level, Tom has really brought a very strong commitment to bringing science to the care and treatment of the mentally ill, and has really been an outstanding leader in that regard. He serves as the chair of the Interagency Autism Coordinating Committee for the Secretary of Health and Human Services, which is, again, an interagency program. Tom was trained at Boston University in the baccalaureate MD program and graduated in 1974 and completed his residency in psychiatry at Langley Porter, which is in San Francisco. Most of his career, though, including earlier time here at NIMH, has been as a basic neuroscientist, focusing on the molecular basis of complex social behaviors, such as social attachment. And he's done really pioneering work looking at social behavior in primates. He served as director of the Yerkes Regional Primate Center from 1994 to 1999, which was after he left his initial NIMH stint, which was at Emory University, and he was founding director of the Center for Behavioral Neuroscience in Atlanta from 1999 to 2002. He has published over 250 scientific articles and 4 books, including The Neurobiology of Parental Care in 2003. He's a member of the Institute of Medicine and has received many awards, including the 2010 Ibsen Prize. I think he brings really a very fresh and informed view of the brain and its relationship to mental illness, and I think that we will have a really exciting talk today. But let me first introduce George.
Roger didn't tell you who he was, or is. I won't tell you about his biography, but I will tell you that he is Roger Meyer, and he is one of the invaluable members of our board. I can tell you that every member of our board is invaluable. They're all, virtually all here, and they've all worked very hard, especially for this event as well. So I'm very happy to have Roger introduce me. Let me also say that for once my 2 parts are put together, I'm the adjunct rabbi here at Adat Shalom, and it's therefore my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of Adat Shalom, which co-sponsors this event, as well as on behalf of the Institute. And before I begin my remarks, let me ask you, if you didn't already, to turn off your cell phone. This event will be recorded, so watch what you say, and we will post the recording if we can, and I think we can, on our website, www.isj.org. More about the organization a little bit later. Let me begin my remarks, which I promise you will be mercifully brief, since I know why you're here. Before I went to rabbinical school, the Dybbuk exemplified my idea of how Judaism understood and responded to the awful affliction of mental illness. The Dybbuk is a Hasidic tale that was made into a play, a movie, and eventually an opera. The plot tells of a poverty-stricken man and a woman who fall passionately in love. The woman's father, in Eastern Europe, of course, where most of the Hasidic tales are set, the woman's father refuses the young man's request to marry his daughter and betroths her instead to a rich Jew, whereupon the poor young man, after studying Kabbalah in the hope of winning her back, dies in a moment of mystical ecstasy. The night before her wedding to the rich man, the bride goes to a graveyard to entreat the spirit of her dead mother to attend the wedding. While in the cemetery, she stops by the graves of a bride and groom who were murdered before their marriage was consummated, and invites their spirits to the wedding as well. Finally, she visits the grave of her beloved and is radically changed. When the wedding ceremony begins the next morning, she suddenly cries out in a man's voice, "You are not my bridegroom." She runs from the wedding back to the cemetery, where that same masculine voice rips from her mouth and declares, "I have returned to my predestined bride, and I shall not leave her." She had been possessed by a dybbuk, an evil spirit, or by the soul of her dead lover. In vain, a Hasidic sage and then the chief rabbi and a Beit Din tried to exorcise this evil thing with pleas, arguments, and incantations, and finally with a judicial decree banishing the dybbuk. And as the stricken bride resists these ministrations, she shrieks and writhes in agony. Her strength wanes, and she dies. Evil spirits, amulets, and exorcism, all the paraphernalia of supernaturalism, were mobilized to account for, ward off, and cure the terrible blight of mental illness, I believed. I could not have been more wrong. True, in the medieval period, many ordinary Jews thought this way. But the Talmud, the great classic corpus of Jewish thought and learning, though it describes classes of mental affliction in the course of settling legal issues for those who suffer from diseases of the spirit, as they called them, were ineligible to testify or held liable or to be held liable in rabbinic courts. The rabbis rejected the notion of evil spirits as, quote, goyish, close the quote, beliefs held by the nations. The rabbis admitted that they did not know why people suffered from the afflictions they described, among them shtuyot, foolishness. I suppose these were people who had some kind of brain disorder and couldn't relate to the lives they were living because of it. What later generations called melancholia are described in the Talmud, and so are persistent, constant nightmares, which later observers have suggested may have something to do with paranoid schizophrenia or ordinary or regular schizophrenia. And the rabbis hoped for the day when cures would be found. In the meantime, rabbinic texts insisted that those who suffered from what Maimonides called sickness of the soul be sustained and cared for with compassion. Long before Philippe Pinel, the late 18th century French physician who led the struggle to free the mentally ill from the chains that bound them to the walls of medieval dungeons where they were beaten and humiliated, long before that time, Jewish law insisted that the community care for those who suffered from these terrible afflictions. In the medieval period and later, many of our great rabbis were also doctors, healers, really. The greatest was Maimonides, whose 11th century medical works include a remarkable description of how the body is hunched and the face is blanched by illness, which he said could be physical or mental in origin, and in either event ought to be treated. He felt that the treatment of mental and physical ailments should be on equal footing and recommended immediate care by what he called a physician of the soul whenever someone tried to commit suicide. Lacking the vast store of observation that science has amassed in recent centuries, Maimonides nevertheless urged that empirical observation guide medical practice. Amazing, in the 11th century. To treat mental illness, he recommended something we now call, or some now call, exposure therapy. And he approved of suggestion. In exposure therapy, as I have been taught, I hope correctly, a patient is helped gradually to confront either the memory or the reality of the feared object of experience in the comforting presence of a supporting therapist. Suggestion is a technique that was later used by the Hasidic masters. In effect, the charismatic healer urges the mentally ill person to change her imaginings or her behavior. Exposure therapy and suggestion are still used here and there today. The latter, suggestion, often with the aid of hypnosis rather than charisma. Of course, the medieval healers and their predecessors prayed and urged the mentally ill to pray to God to heal them and to repent if they had sinned. But they also believed that physical health was important in combating sickness of the soul and, remarkably, vice versa. When scientific medicine began, as you probably know, Jews became exceedingly active in the fields of psychology and psychiatry, initially perhaps because both were on the periphery of medicine and therefore more open to the oppressed Jews of early and not so early modern times. The catalog of history is filled with the names of these doctors and research scientists, of whom Sigmund Freud is probably the most renowned. In our time, as you know, Jews continue in disproportionate numbers to work in this field. Like other Americans, we Jews are painfully aware, and last week's massacre was just another horrific reminder, that despite the great strides that science and medicine have made in seeking to understand and heal the afflictions of the soul, we as a nation have dismally failed to see to it that those who need care get it, and get it early enough to protect themselves, their families, and the rest of us from the terrible consequences of mental illness. This is not the moment to explore why that is so. It is a time to learn about what frontier research might enable us to do in the future if only we were ready for it. Increasing human knowledge has always been a ground for hope, and we look forward to Dr. Insel's words and to the rekindling of our hopes for progress in this vitally important but underserved area. Dr. Insel.